Horror fans were excited. A new game set in the Dead by Daylight universe? A brutal, narrative-driven experience from Supermassive Games? It sounded like a dream come true. But now that we're a few months on from the release of the casting of Frank Stone, I have to say, this game sucks. So, what went wrong? Why does this game suck? How could a horror game with a setting with as much potential as Dead by Daylight fall flat? Those are the questions I'm about to answer for you. Before we begin though, if you do enjoy the video, please make sure to subscribe as we are trying to hit 2,000 subscribers by the end of the year, but let's get into things. When the casting of Frank Stone was first announced, one of the most exciting aspects was its connection to Dead by Daylight. After all, DBD has one of the most intriguing horror universes in gaming, a place where supernatural killers and desperate survivors are all trapped in an endless, nightmarish game controlled by the entity. The potential here was massive. This could have been an opportunity to dive deeper into the lore, to explore how the killers are chosen, or to give us a first-hand look at the entity's influence outside of its twisted trial grounds. Maybe we'd get to see what life was like before certain killers were taken into DBD, or how people slowly succumb to the darkness that transforms them into these monsters. But instead, the casting of Frank Stone decided to squander that potential. At its core, Dead by Daylight has always been about more than just killers and survivors. It's about the terror of being hunted, the despair of feeling trapped, and the horrifying realization that escape will not come easy. It has a unique identity, blending supernatural horror with psychological dread. Yet, the casting of Frank Stone doesn't feel like it belongs in this universe. Sure, it has some familiar aspects. You fix a couple of generators, people get placed on hooks, and you can collect doll versions of some of the killers. But it rarely leans into these lore elements that make DBD so compelling. The game tells the story of Frank Stone, a brutal serial killer whose actions leave a lasting impact. But it doesn't truly connect to the entity's realm in any interesting way. For a game set in the Dead by Daylight world, it does shockingly little to expand or deepen that universe. There's barely any reference to the entity, no real exploration of how killers are chosen, and no major ties to the game's existing characters. Let's talk about Frank Stone himself. The Dead by Daylight roster is filled with terrifying figures, from supernatural wraiths to deranged killers with tragic pasts. Each one has a distinct personality if you look for it, a horrifying backstory, and unique abilities that make them memorable. But Frank Stone, he feels boring. Yes, he's violent. Yes, he's menacing. But his character lacks the eerie, otherworldly presence that makes Dead by Daylight killers so unsettling. While other killers have tragic, often supernatural origins that make them feel larger than life, Frank is just a guy that slashes you, something we've seen countless times in hundreds of other pieces of horror media. Compare him to other killers in Dead by Daylight, and you see that this is just absolutely ridiculous. Frank Stone's backstory, while grim, yes, lacks a lot of depth. He's just a violent man who killed a lot of people, and in a universe filled with killers who are cursed, possessed, or twisted by supernatural forces, that makes him feel strangely out of place. I actually think the concept of making a new killer for this game at all was a mistake. It's set in the Dead by Daylight universe. We could have had the characters trying to escape from multiple original killers from Dead by Daylight. This is a gargantuan waste. The game barely acknowledges the wider Dead by Daylight mythos. There are some references to the entity and whatnot, but it plays like a standalone horror story that happens to exist in the same world, but without actually embracing the elements that make that world feel special. Even from a gameplay perspective, the casting of Frank Stone misses opportunities to incorporate Dead by Daylight mechanics in creative ways. What if it had included chase sequences that mirrored Dead by Daylight's intense heart-pounding loops, where the emphasis is on how you're going to break line of sight and create distance? What if the game allowed you to hide in lockers or use pallets to block the killer? These very small nods to Dead by Daylight could have made the casting of Frank Stone feel more like an actual Dead by Daylight experience, rather than just a generic horror story that just happens to be at the same time. Fixing a generator every couple of hours is not enough. Even something as simple as an interactive mechanic where a character is hooked and another character has to try and rescue them or something. but that could have been an exciting reference. Instead, the casting of Frank Stone sticks to traditional horror game mechanics, missing an opportunity to make itself stand out, and completes the absolute bare minimum to qualify as a game in the Dead by Daylight universe. Ooh, fix a generator. Ooh, look, this character's on a hook for some reason. It's nonsense. It had the chance to flesh out the Dead by Daylight universe, introduce compelling new lore, and give us something fresh, but instead, it plays things safe, telling a standard slasher story that doesn't feel unique to the Dead by Daylight mythos. You could remove any semblance of Dead by Daylight from this game, and very little would change. For long-time Dead by Daylight players like myself, with over 1,000 hours played because I'm a sado, that's the biggest disappointment of all. The casting of Frank Stone should have been an exciting deep dive into one of horror gaming's most fascinating universes. Instead, it feels like a wasted opportunity, one that barely scratches the surface of what makes Dead by Daylight special. But if we leave the Dead by Daylight stuff at the door, kick it out, off you go, let's actually judge the game that we do have rather than moaning about the game that we didn't get. Horror games live and die by their stories. A well-told horror narrative doesn't just scare, it immerses, unsettles, and lingers in the back of your mind after the credits have rolled. The casting of Frank Stone had every opportunity to be one of those horror experiences. The setup I actually thought was kinda promising. A group of young people unknowingly unleashes an unstoppable killer, setting off a chain of terrifying events, set across 2 time periods. On paper, this could have been a gripping and brutal descent into chaos, but in execution, the game's story never quite comes together. The characters feel hollow, the pacing kills the tension, and as I mentioned earlier, Frank Stone himself fails to make an intriguing impression. One of the biggest issues is the cast of the protagonists. Supermassive Games built a reputation on creating horror experiences where player choices determine who lives and who dies, but that only works if you actually care a little bit about whether the characters survive. There are some characters in all of these games. Every single Supermassive game has at least, I'd say, 2 characters that are incredibly annoying and you're not that bothered if they die or not. But the rest of the cast, most of the characters, will at least have some form of redeeming qualities, and there are some characters in this game like that. I really liked Madison, but she was one of the only tolerable characters in this entire game. The cast feels painfully generic, every character is just a standard archetype. Don't get me wrong, archetypes are fine as a foundation, but they need something more to make them compelling. Instead, the characters in the casting of Frank Stone feel like they exist solely to be killed off. Their dialogue often comes across as forced, as if it's trying too hard to sound realistic, but instead feels incredibly unnatural. And because the game never gives us enough of a reason to connect with any of these people, their deaths lack emotional weight. I lost one character in my first playthrough, and it just happened and I was like, oh god, well you're dead now. I didn't care! The game also suffers from serious pacing issues. Horror is all about tension and knowing that something terrible is coming, but not quite when and how. And look, this can be a difficult balance to achieve. It's not necessarily easy, but that doesn't excuse the fact that they got it all wrong in this game. There is a difference between building suspense and dragging things out, and the casting of Frank Stone really struggles to find the correct balance. The first half of the game takes far too long to get going, and I'm quite concerned about the future of Supermassive Games because this is also an issue they had with The Devil in Me. Horror narratives need setup, sure, but when that setup is filled with long-winded conversations, uneventful exploration, and setting up character dynamics that just aren't interesting, it kills all momentum. It's frustrating to spend so much time waiting for something, anything, to happen, and then once the horror does kick in, the game falls into a predictable rhythm. A character wanders into danger, the atmosphere shifts, a few unsettling noises signal that something is wrong. Frank Stone appears. The character will either die in a over-the-top gruesome way, that's good, we like that part, or they escape. Usually, they'll escape. When I went for my Zero Survivor run, I realised it's actually quite difficult to kill a decent amount of these characters off. Then, the cycle will just repeat with the next victim. Instead of escalating the tension or subverting the expectation, the game locks itself into a pattern that quickly becomes incredibly easy to predict. Even the so-called scares feel formulaic. Supermassive is known for relying on jump scares, but in their best games they at least felt a little bit earned, built up through some form of atmosphere and tension. Here, many of the scares feel forced, thrown in just to startle rather than to genuinely unsettle. There's no real fear of the unknown, no lingering sense of unease, it's just loud noises and sudden movements, which lose their impact the more they're used. The first time you have to actually sort of fight Frank Stone with the camera, I was like, oh, okay, an interactive gameplay element, Supermassive are evolving. But then the third time you have to do it, it's just as simple as pressing a QuickTime event. You just point the camera at him, and then you press the button to do the light thingy. That's it. It's the same. It never evolves, it never changes, it's just that a few times. It's boring. On top of that, the game completely undermines the importance of player choice. Supermassive Games built its reputation on giving us meaningful decisions, choices that matter. And look, they haven't really done that much since Until Dawn, and that's a crying shame and it's a topic for a different video. But that's the premise of these games, that's why we're buying them. The stories in these games are nowhere near good enough to buy them without that interactive storytelling element. The games are nowhere near scary enough for us to play them without that interactive story element. Even if it's a bit of a disguise and we don't have as many choices as we think, that is why we are playing the games. But even here, it feels like they've taken it to a new extreme. Every single choice feels like an illusion. Whether you pick a dialogue option or another one, whether you choose to go left instead of right, it rarely changes anything. The big decisions are literally always just a different line of dialogue or a character dying. But it's always so obvious what's going to lead to a character dying and what's not, that the only way you would get a character dead is if you were trying to, or if you just weren't paying attention like I was when I got my first character killed. It often feels like no matter what you do, certain events are locked into place. One of the things I hate the most, and they have done this a few times now, is characters that will die regardless of what you do. There is no way to save them. The only thing your decision changes is when they die. They did this in House of Ashes and I thought it was really annoying, and they've done it in this game as well. It's so obvious when a character is like this as well. If there is a character who feels like a main part of the story, but you never get to control them at any point, you just know they will die eventually, and it completely ruins it. We're seeing through the facade here, and that's when your interactive storytelling framework really falls apart. If survival doesn't depend on skill or decision making, then where's the tension? What am I doing here? At its core, the casting of Frank Stone had all the ingredients of a terrifying horror experience. It has an eerie setting. Hell, it has two. It has a brutal killer who's not very interesting, but still, he's still brutal, and the promise of meaningful choices. But it fumbles nearly every aspect of its storytelling. The characters aren't memorable enough to care about. The pacing drags before falling into repetition. Frank Stone himself lacks the presence of a horror icon, and the illusion of player choice is far too thin to hold up under any scrutiny. Instead of a gripping interactive nightmare, we get a horror story that never quite lands. It doesn't build its world up enough to expand Dead by Daylight's lore. It doesn't push its slasher elements enough to create a new horror icon, and it doesn't use its branching narratives in a way that feels like it immerses you or even does what it says on the tin. There are some flashes of potential in this game. A few well executed scares, the voice performances are okay, they're good, and moments where the atmosphere does work, although they are scarce. But it never fully commits to being something unique. It doesn't embrace the slasher genre in a way that makes it stand out, nor does it lead into Dead by Daylight's lore nearly enough to feel like a meaningful expansion of that universe. Instead, it ends up feeling like a generic horror game with a recognisable name attached to it. Supermassive has done better than this, and Dead by Daylight deserve better than this. Here, the formula is too obvious, the stakes don't feel real, and the horror never sinks in. That's what makes the casting of Frank Stone such a disappointment. It wasn't doomed from the start, it had the foundation for something special. Something that could have stood alongside Until Dawn and The Quarry as one of the best cinematic horror games we have. Instead, it plays it safe, offering a forgettable story that doesn't live up to its potential, and in horror, being forgettable is the worst sin of all. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. I hope that you enjoyed it a lot more than I enjoyed the casting of Frank Stone. If you did enjoy it, please leave a like, it really does help, and remember, we are trying to hit 2,000 subscribers by the end of the year. I upload at least one video a week, but for now that is all. Have a nice day, and goodbye.